Don't look away from what I'm about to tell you, because I almost missed it, and if I had, my sister would be dead right now. Her name is Loretta, 53 years old, retired school librarian, lives in a green and white house on Birchwood Court in Decatur, Georgia. The same house she bought with her own savings after her husband Marcus passed away 6 years ago. She planted rose bushes along the front porch that summer, said it helped her grieve, said tending something alive helped her remember that she still was, too. I am 62. I drove trucks for 31 years, mostly long haul, mostly alone. My name is not important right now. What's important is that I am the only family Loretta has left. Our parents are gone. We had a brother, Calvin, but cancer took him in 2019. So it's just us. It has been just us for a while now. When she called me 3 springs ago and said she had met someone, I was somewhere outside of Amarillo, Texas, eating a gas station sandwich and watching the sun go down. I remember thinking, good for her. She had been alone long enough. She deserved something soft after everything hard she had been through. His name was Darnell, 47 years old, drove a clean black SUV, worked in logistics, said all the right things. He brought her flowers on the second date and fixed her back porch screen on the third. I only met him twice before the wedding. Once at a cookout she threw in the backyard. Once at Christmas. Both times he shook my hand firm, looked me in the eye, called me sir, even though I told him not to. I thought, all right, man. Maybe you're the real thing. They got married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony at a venue in Stone Mountain. Loretta wore ivory, carried white roses. She cried when she said her vows and laughed at herself for crying. And I had to look down at my shoes for a second, because I was not going to let myself lose it in front of all those people. I drove back to Memphis that Sunday feeling like something was settled, like I could stop worrying about her for a while. I was wrong. The first sign I did not recognize as a sign. She called me in October, about 4 months after the wedding, and said she'd been having headaches. Bad ones. Pressure behind her eyes, she said. She figured it was stress. Darnell had recently changed jobs and money was a little tight. She had gone back to part-time work at the county library to help cover things. I told her to see a doctor, and she said she would. The second sign I chalked up to age. She called again in December and said her hands had been trembling. Just slightly, just sometimes, but enough to bother her. She dropped a glass at dinner. Darnell had laughed. Not meanly, she said, just surprised, and helped her clean it up. I told her to go to a neurologist. She said she had an appointment scheduled for January. The third sign I almost didn't hear about at all. I was visiting for her birthday in February. We were sitting on her back porch, the one Darnell had fixed the screen on, drinking sweet tea and watching the neighbor's dog bark at nothing across the fence. She looked thin, not dramatically, not the kind of thin that makes you gasp, just the quiet kind that you notice after not seeing someone for a couple of months. Her face was a little drawn. She said she hadn't had much appetite lately. I said, Loretta, how long has this been going on? She thought about it. Since maybe November, she said. Maybe October. I said, that's 4 months. She shrugged. She said Darnell thought it was anxiety. Said she had always been a worrier. Said once things settled down financially, she would probably bounce back. I looked at my sister sitting in the chair that had been in her backyard for 15 years, wrapped in a cardigan in 55-degree weather, and something moved through me that I did not have a name for yet. It was not quite alarm. It was quieter than that. More like the feeling you get when you are driving late at night and you see something on the road ahead and you are not sure yet if it is a deer or a bag of garbage, but your foot has already moved toward the brake. I drove back to Memphis the next morning and I could not shake it. 2 weeks later, she was in the hospital. Dana called me on a Tuesday evening. Said she had collapsed in the kitchen. Said the ambulance came. Said she was at Grady Memorial. Said the doctors were running tests. His voice was steady and calm the way voices sometimes are when they are trying to be. I was in my truck in a parking lot in Nashville at the time, and I turned that truck around and I drove 4 hours to Atlanta without stopping once. She was in a room on the 3rd floor with an IV in her arm and a monitor beeping soft behind her head. She looked smaller than she had 2 weeks before, which did not seem possible. but was true. I held her hand and said, "I'm here." She said, "I don't know what's happening to me, Russell. I don't know what's wrong." The neurologist thought maybe MS. The hospitalist mentioned peripheral neuropathy. They were waiting on blood work. Darnell sat in the corner chair most of the time I was there, scrolling his phone. When the doctors came in, he stood up, asked questions, nodded seriously. Played the concerned husband well enough that I had no reason yet to look at him sideways. I stayed in Atlanta 4 days. I slept on Loretta's couch, drove back and forth to the hospital, brought her things she asked for, her reading glasses, a particular sweater, the paperback she had been working on before all this started. Darnell came and went. He was never there in the mornings, said he had to get to work, had to keep things going with the bills. That made sense. I did not question it. On the fourth day, as I was heading down the hallway to her room after getting coffee from the vending machine on the second floor, a woman stepped out of the nurse's station and touched my arm. I stopped. She was a black woman, maybe mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wore her hair pulled back tight. Her badge said, "Head Nurse, Floor 3. Her name was Cynthia. She looked at me for a moment like she was deciding something, and then she said, quietly, "Are you the patient in 312's brother?" I said yes. She said, "Can you come with me for a minute?" She walked me into a small room with no windows, a consultation room, the kind they use to give bad news, and she closed the door behind us. She did not sit down. She stood near the door with her arms crossed, and she looked at me and she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I could lose my job for telling you this without authorization. But I have been a nurse for 22 years, and there are things you recognize after long enough. Things that look a certain way and only look that way for one reason." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The toxicology panel we ran 2 days ago came back with elevated levels of arsenic. Not trace levels, elevated. And your sister has been showing symptoms consistent with chronic low-dose arsenic poisoning for several months." I heard what she said. I understood each word individually. But for a moment, they did not assemble into meaning. I stood there in that little room and I said, "I'm sorry?" She said it again, slower. My legs did not go weak the way they do in movies. What happened was the opposite. Everything in me went very still and very cold. The way it does right before something serious. The way it did the one time I blew a tire at 70 miles an hour on I-40 and had maybe 3 seconds to make the right decision. I said, "Who knows about this?" She said the attending physician had flagged it and a report had been filed with the hospital's patient safety officer. She said law enforcement would likely be contacted within the next 24 to 48 hours. She said she was not supposed to be talking to me, but she had seen the husband come and go and she had seen his face when the doctor spoke, and she said this quietly, with no drama in her voice at all. She said, "The look of a man who is scared of being caught is different from the look of a man who is scared for his wife." She said she had seen both looks. She knew which one was which. I thanked her. I don't remember what words I used. I walked out of that little room, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, and I breathed. And then I called my cousin Wendell, who had retired from the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office 3 years prior, and I told him what I had just been told. Wendell listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted, and then he said, "Do not say a word to anyone in that house. Not to him. Not even to Loretta yet." He said, "Let me make a call." The call Wendell made was to a detective he had worked with for years, a woman named Investigator Tanya Birch with the DeKalb County Police Department. She had worked financial crimes and domestic cases, and she had, in Wendell's words, seen everything there is to see and was not surprised by any of it anymore. She called me directly that afternoon. We spoke for 40 minutes. She explained what was likely to happen procedurally. The hospital's report would trigger a formal investigation. There would be a review of Loretta's medical records, and depending on what they found, they might move quickly or they might need to build the case carefully before making any move. She told me the most important thing I could do right then was act normal. Do not tip him off. Do not let him see anything change in your face or behavior. I asked her, how does something like this happen? How does a man poison his wife? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Usually it's slow and it's patient and it's not impulsive." She said in cases like this, there is almost always a financial motive. She asked me if I knew anything about a life insurance policy. I said I didn't, but I started thinking. I drove to Loretta's house that evening. Darnell was at the hospital, and I sat in her living room and I looked around. I looked at the framed photos on the wall and the bookshelves full of the books she had collected over 30 years, and the little ceramic bowl she kept her keys in by the door. I looked at this life she had built, carefully and quietly and on her own terms, and I thought about how she had let him in and trusted him and married him. And I felt something rise up in me that I have not felt since I was much younger, a hot and specific kind of anger that had nowhere to go. I did not touch anything. I left and I drove to the Holiday Inn 3 miles away, and I lay on top of the covers and I stared at the ceiling until 2 in the morning. Investigator Birch moved faster than she had suggested she might. Within a week they had obtained a search warrant. They found in the garage of Loretta's house, the garage Darnell had turned into his personal workspace and kept locked, a quantity of a commercially available pesticide with a high arsenic compound, purchased 6 months prior with a debit card in his name. They found a second purchase receipt in his email 7 months prior at a different store, a different county. They also found what they had suspected. Loretta had taken out a life insurance policy 8 months into the marriage, $250,000. Darnell had been the one to suggest it, had helped her fill out the paperwork, had kept a copy of the policy in a folder in his desk drawer. She had been sick for 4 months by then. He had not been impatient. He had been methodical. When they arrested him, he was in the hospital parking lot, walking toward the entrance with a coffee cup from the Starbucks drive-thru. 2 plainclothes officers. He did not run, did not make a scene. I was told he looked at the ground for a long time without speaking and then asked for a lawyer. I was inside with Loretta when it happened. She was sitting up a little better that day, had some color back. The doctors had stopped the poisoning source, had not allowed outside food or drink for days at that point, under the guise of dietary restrictions for her treatment, and her body was beginning the slow work of clearing itself. She did not know yet exactly what had been found. The investigators had asked me to wait until they had made the arrest before telling her. I was sitting in the chair next to her bed, pretending to read something on my phone, when Investigator Birch sent me a text. 2 words. It's done. I put the phone down. I looked at my sister. She was watching a nature documentary, with the sound low and her reading glasses on, and she looked, in that moment, so ordinary and so herself that I had to take a breath before I could speak. She looked over at me. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Loretta, there's something I need to tell you." I will not try to describe the full shape of what the next hour looked like. I will say that she was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. She did not cry right away. She sat with it the way she has always sat with hard things, very still, very interior, processing it at a depth I cannot follow. Then she took her glasses off and pressed her hands over her face and made a sound I had not heard from her since the night Marcus died. And I got up and sat on the edge of her bed and put my arm around her, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. What do you say to someone who has just learned that the person they loved and married and brought into the home they built with their own hands? What do you say to someone who has just learned that person spent 8 months trying to kill them? There are no words for that. There is only being present. So I stayed. The case moved through the courts over the following year. Darnell was charged with aggravated battery and attempted murder. His defense argued the arsenic was for pest control, that he had no knowledge it was harming her. The prosecution had the purchase receipts, the timing, the policy, the medical records, and a forensic toxicologist who testified for nearly 2 hours. He was convicted on both counts, sentenced to 22 years. Loretta is still in Decatur, still in her house on Birchwood Court. She hired someone to redo the garage, tore everything out, put in shelving for the boxes of books she had stored in the spare bedroom for years. The roses she planted when Marcus died bloomed again last April, fuller than they had in a long time. She calls me every Sunday. We talk about nothing important most of the time. A show she's watching, a book she's recommending, how the weather is in Memphis versus Atlanta. Sometimes she'll say something offhand that lets me know she is still processing things, still turning it over in her mind the way you do when something doesn't fully become real for a long time. One Sunday she said, I keep thinking about how normal everything felt, how completely ordinary every day was, how I just thought I was getting old or getting sick, and I never once, not once, thought to question what was in my own glass of water. I didn't know what to say to that either. What I know is this: the nurse who pulled me into that room, who risked her job and her license to put her hand on my arm in a hospital hallway, she made a decision in about 15 seconds that saved my sister's life. She did not know me. She did not know Lata. She saw something in a chart and something in a man's face, and she decided that staying quiet was not something she was willing to do. I went back to Grady a few months later and asked for her. She had transferred to another unit. I left a card at the nurse's station addressed to Cynthia, floor 3. I do not know if she ever received it. I hope she did. I hope she knows. Because the hardest part of all of this is not what Darnell did, though what he did was monstrous. The hardest part is what my sister said on that Sunday phone call. How normal it all felt. How trust, real trust, the kind you build slowly over dinners and small kindnesses, and the man who fixes your porch screen without being asked, how that kind of trust can be turned into a weapon against you, slowly, quietly, in your own home, by the person you chose. My sister chose to live in that house anyway. She chose the roses and the books and the Sunday phone calls. She chose to stay in the life she had built and not let what he did reduce it to rubble. I think about that more than I think about him. I think about the kind of person it takes to make that choice. I have always known my sister was strong. I did not know until all of this exactly how strong. I still think about the garage sometimes. The one Darnell kept locked. The one where they found 2 separate receipts, 2 separate stores, 2 separate counties. Like he had thought it through. Like he had planned around being caught and decided he wouldn't be. That kind of patience is hard to reckon with. It doesn't look like what we think evil looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It fixes your porch screen. It brings flowers on a second date. It shakes your hand firm and looks you in the eye and calls you sir. What I've come to understand sitting with all of this over the past few years is that what happened to Loretta was not just one man's cruelty. It was also the story of what happens when a person's goodness gets used against them. She trusted because she had always been trustworthy. She opened her home because she had always kept an open home. That is not her failure. That is her character. And character, I've learned, cannot protect you from every harm, but it is still the only thing worth having. The nurse, Cynthia, made a decision in a hallway in about 15 seconds. She had spent 22 years building the kind of judgment that lets you read a situation clearly, honestly, without flinching from what you see. That is not luck. That is something you develop deliberately, over time, by paying attention and refusing to look away from hard things. She could have stayed quiet and stayed safe. She chose otherwise. And that choice, made in 15 seconds, built over 22 years, is the reason my sister is alive. I think about my cousin Wendell too. Retired, yes, but still sharp, still connected, still someone who knew the difference between the right move and the fast move. He told me to stay quiet, to not tip anything off, to be patient. That restraint, in a moment when everything in me wanted to do something immediate and loud, that restraint was its own kind of strength. There is a version of this story where I say something to Darnell that night, where I let my anger run ahead of my judgment, where I give him enough warning to disappear or destroy evidence or lawyer up before the investigators have what they need. That version ends differently. I have thought about that version many times. What saved Loretta was not rage. It was precision. It was a nurse who had the moral backbone to speak up when silence would have been easier. It was a detective who knew how to build a case carefully. It was a retired deputy who knew when to move fast and when to hold still. It was my sister's own body, which had been fighting longer than any of us knew. Loretta is still in her house, still tending the roses Marcus never got to see in full bloom. She is not the same as she was before all this. I don't think you can be, but she has not let it hollow her out either. She made a choice, quietly and without ceremony, to keep living forward, to not let what was done to her become the definition of her life. I don't know what to call that, except what it is. Strength. The kind that doesn't make noise. The kind that gets up the next morning anyway. If you take nothing else from what I've shared today, take this: the people who are still standing after something like this. They didn't survive because nothing bad happened to them. They survived because they kept going after it did. And the people who tried to stop it, they did so because over years and years they built something inside themselves that held when it mattered. Good judgment, honest character, the will to act even when it costs something. Those things don't come from nowhere. They come from the choices you make before the crisis arrives.